Thank you so much, Helen, and also Sanya for really setting the tone for this plenary session, Women's Financial Inclusion, Leadership and Diversity. We'll jump right into the panel discussion, ladies and gentlemen. Before I invite the moderator to come up, I'd like to invite the speakers, the panelists, excuse me, for this session. I'd like to invite Elsie Awadzi, the Second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Ghana, to please come forward and take a seat. Our next panelist is Jamil Ahmad, the Governor, State Bank of Pakistan. Please come forward. Mr. Josefa Masitambua, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Fiji. Hazel Gonzalez, a Vice President, Banco Central de Reserva de El Salvador. And the final panelist is Amina Tirana, Head of Policy and Measurement, Social Impact Visa. Please come forward. And to moderate this session, we have Pia Roman, ladies and gentlemen, the Director of the Office of the UNSGSA, to moderate this session.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Very excited to moderate this power panel. I think with the name itself, you can already... Okay, could we request some fresh water for the panelists, please? We will have very intense discussions and we might need the water. There is no gender balance in this panel. Yeah, so I think we have been set up excellently by the two presentations today, the Findex summary as well as the overview of the AFI mapping. My biggest takeaway there are three things. One is that we have accomplished so much as a network. The gender gap decreased for the first time since we started Findex in 2011. And that, I am sure, in no small measure, was because of all the actions that you have taken in this network, the Denarau Action Plan, and all the things that, as a network, you have done in your own countries. I think you all deserve a round of applause. Also to wake up the crowd post-lunch. And I think we will see it in the mapping too, just the substantial initiatives that the AFI members have done. But the other takeaway is definitely there is still so much to be done. The headline figures represent a decrease in the gender gap, but if we look, maybe in country, in the regions, if we look deeper at the data, we know that there is still so much more to be done. We have to go beyond gender parity in account ownership and really see whether access to financial services really provides effective access to products that build women's resilience, financial health, and tools to really seize economic opportunities. And that is our big challenge as a community. But I know that we will hear from the panel that we will get there. And the last one, I think, is really seeing that access is not the end, right? It is really a means towards positive outcomes. And I was actually very pleased to see the lobby of the GPF, where we have the AFI cubes, but we also have the SDGs underpinning them. And in this panel, we, of course, focus on SDG number 5. So just premising on the fact that, yes, we have done so much, but no, there is still much more that needs to be done. I am very pleased to moderate this panel today. And, the work has to really be beyond policy. And Helen, I'm not challenging the egg, but I will recast it in 3 Ps. Policy, but we also need public goods, digital public goods, the infrastructure, as Helen pointed out, the second layer of the egg. And we need to enable the private sector through the products that really make sense for women. So let us hear from our panel today, and maybe I could start with, we have the esteemed deputy governors here, but so that it could be more conversational, I hope you don't mind if I call you by your first names. We have Elsie, and let me start a question for you. I think yesterday, and we all saw this in social media of the AFI, all the announcements, you hosted a leaders' breakfast. I would call that a power breakfast in women's leadership, institutional diversity, and importance in making male allies. So we have, of course, our DG here from PG. What were some key points and takeaways from your discussion yesterday? If you could give the crowd here who were not at the breakfast a sneak peek at some of the key points from the breakfast yesterday. Let's start off with that, Elsie.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to try and attempt to synthesize what we talked about. First and foremost, I agree it was a power breakfast in every sense of the word. Number one, the fact that we have 32 leaders in the room, 14 of which were men. And for me, that was very powerful. It was powerful because I could see many women leaders. These were central bank governors, or deputy governors, or heads of other regulatory institutions. But we had 14 strong men who were key allies of women. And for me, that was a really good picture to see. The discussions were very animated. One, there was agreement on the fact that there wasn't gender balance, gender equity in top leadership of central banks and regulatory institutions that are making policy and laws that affect access to finance. And the fact that that is something that needed to be worked on. So I'll give you some statistics. For example, the OMFIF Gender Balance Index of 2021 said that only 15 central banks around the world are headed by a woman. And out of 31 central bank governors appointed in 2020, only one was a woman. There are only 10% of heads of institutions are women. And within the AFI network, 10 member institutions are led by a woman, and 40 member institutions have at least one female deputy head of institution. Now, this is a lot of progress, so let's celebrate that. But it is also not at all even the beginning of what is possible. And I think yesterday the conversations were very clear about there are capable women in every one of our countries. The problem is that they are not visible to the appointing authorities, and the fact that a lot more has to be done to find them. Because there are benefits in finding women, in having women in leadership and more gender equity. One, it is only fair because in many of our countries, women represent at least 50% of the population. In some cases that were mentioned yesterday, there were more women than men in those countries. And so it's only fair to see a fair representation of women in leadership, in top leadership. But what is more is the fact that with more women in top leadership, we begin to see things, different perspectives in the way policies and regulations are made. These then begin to help us towards more inclusion, financial inclusion. What is more, this models for the private sector, the actual providers of financial services, how important it is to have women in their top leadership. And therefore, then they are able to provide, craft and design products and services that help women as well as the general population. So there was agreement on all of this. Now what we find, just in wrapping up on this, what we found was that in a number of countries that were represented at breakfast, legal mandate had been important in promoting more women in leadership. For some, it was a constitutional provision, some act of parliament, or the other. For some, it was policy within the institution. But what we found was more profound was champions, was the role of champions, individual champions, and sometimes these champions were men, who made it a point to seek out capable women and draw them in, to make them more visible, and to actually encourage them to be more confident to step up to leadership roles. So basically, we ended the breakfast with a call for action. Every one of us being committed to doing what we can to be the champions in our various institutions, and hopefully also have more such frank discussions to galvanize more going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that insight itself is very promising. We definitely look forward to what the champions and the ripples of all the things that you will do together as champions of this. And really just going beyond balance for balance sake, which is already good, but benefiting from the institutional diversity that comes with it, which I think will trickle to the institutions and to the entities that you also supervise and regulate. So thank you for sharing that. It's interesting how Elsie started with data and facts, right? She gave us how many were at the breakfast, how many of the central bank governors were women. And data is really what compels us to act, because then we see where the gaps are and where we should go. And so on that point, if I may turn over to Joseph, and you've done a lot on this, on collecting gender disaggregated data in Fiji. If you could share with us, what is the role of sex disaggregated data in evidence-based policy making in Fiji? But we want to understand the journey that you took to get there. What data did you decide to collect? How did you analyze that? And then translate that into policy?
Thank you. First of all, let me just say that I was wondering what my qualification to be on this panel is, but I'm flattered. But I've been in central banking for 25 years, and a large part of that I've been involved in financial inclusion. So I'm not a new face around GPF, and I've been fortunate enough that my journey in central banking has taken me around financial inclusion and financial regulation. So I think I do meet some minimum standards to pass or to contribute to this panel. And also as a father and a grandfather of 5 beautiful granddaughters, I have a huge skin in this game. So so financial inclusion and Fiji's journey. We started our first national financial inclusion strategy in 2010, and like many others, we started off with access, promoting access, driving the access points out, and then we've transitioned and we've just launched our third strategy. And now we're starting to say, okay, that's fine. We've checked the box, as the Deputy Governor in Kenya said, and now we have to start drilling down into whether we are providing the financial services that that the vulnerable need, and especially women. So our challenge around addressing this, and after our second financial inclusion strategy, we we had a policy on disaggregated data. And one of the challenges we had, and I think a lot of supervisors and development staff out there will appreciate the inertia that we had to push the financial service providers to provide data that they feel that doesn't necessarily contribute to their bottom line. So we had to push that a bit. So that was one of the challenges. These legacy systems that they have, which appalled us a bit, that they wouldn't find it necessarily something that they would want to know at any point in time, how many women accounts or how many the breakdown by gender. We understand that there's challenges around companies and SMEs around classifying, but that's another challenge we faced. The SME classification, and one other thing is the unique data set, so that we are able to prevent double counting, so that we can really get to the precise numbers that we are talking about. As the moderator had mentioned, good data guides good policy. I'm not really a numbers man. I am more of a field type of person, but I've come to appreciate that you can't improve what you can't measure. So those are some of the challenges. It's been a long journey, but we've finally been able to have at least three sets of disaggregated data, and this is enabling us to have a grounds to lean on the financial service providers and say like, okay, you're doing enough, because one challenge we have is they like to do a lot. We must commend them for helping us in this journey of reducing our gender gap. We have reduced our gender gap, even though we are slightly above our peer or developing partners, and we attribute this a lot to our development partners, but we need to push them more. We need to target their effort more into what we want or what we see rather than what they feel gains them the most mileage. So those are some of the challenges and the journey that we've had so far.
Thank you for sharing that. And despite the challenges, because of the clear vision, you're able to get those sets of sex disaggregated data that has helped in policy. If I may turn over to DG Sima, another example of someone with a clear vision, a policy from the State Bank of Pakistan on banking on equity. I think as UNSGSA, Her Majesty also championed and supported this very important policy of Pakistan. And, you know, if you could tell us more about the ambition, why did you think of putting this in place? What are your, you know, how will you measure success, and what will success look like for you for this policy?
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. Way back, I think in 2017, we had a national financial inclusion vision at the central bank. And we worked very hard. And as Sanya was saying, the top line numbers were good because financial inclusion, which we can on a baseline measure as financial accounts, was growing and we were doing well. But it's a country of 220 million people, say about 110 million adults. And in that, we only had 20 million women with accounts. Those were just accounts. Of that, only 11 million women had active accounts. So we have a serious issue. So that's one reason why we had to do this. And the second, perhaps more concerning reason was that the gender gap was actually growing. And women were just not getting included at the same pace as men. So we concluded, and this was like a few years ago, that something had to be done. And we had to move from, it's okay, here is this product, and it's for men and women, which is gender neutral, to gender intentional. So so those were the two reasons. And so we decided that it was no longer possible just to talk. And I'm afraid that tends to happen a lot. We talk, and with all respect, we come to conferences, we talk a lot about women, we say all the right things. Some of the men especially understand it, perhaps they don't believe it. I'm sorry to have to say that, but I think all the women in this room will agree with that. So we decided, and frankly it wasn't me, it was a lot of the men, and it began before I even joined the central bank. We decided that we would use our regulatory remit to actually come up with a policy. But we didn't force it down anyone's throat. We went through one of the longest consultative process with the financial institutions, with civic society, as it's called, with partners internationally and locally, with a number of sessions, and those were all during COVID, so they were all on Zoom and so on. And then we came up with the policy, which was finalized and rolled out in September of last year. And it has 5 key pillars. The first is that the institutions we regulate must be diverse in their workforce. Because if you have men working for men They will design products for men. They may not do it intentionally. It's just the way they are, as they've been brought up. So we had, and if you looked at the banking sector, only 13% of the workforce is women. And there are banks, which I'll remain nameless, who I know from my background, who said, we will not hire women. So we have set a target for 2024 for them to have 20% women. And there is no deviation. And each one has been given a target. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar we asked, and there's subsets, and I won't go into all those details, but we then asked that each bank sets up a women's department, agreed to by their boards, and applies a gender lens to every product and service that they have. For example, when there's saving products, women will want to save, as we've talked about these saving clubs, we call them committees or kitties, and so on. They must look at that need. The women's need is often for the home. It's often for their children. And so we asked, so those committees have all been set up. Gender lens is to be applied to all existing. We've given timelines which we will monitor. So that's that. The third pillar is women's champions at each access point. We're still very much a bricks and mortar country, although digital is moving very fast. So each of the major branches of each of the financial institutions is to have, by 2024, 75% will have a women's champion. It can be a man, that's okay, but they will have somebody who will make sure that any woman who comes to the call center or to the app or to the branch is treated with value, is welcomed and respected. So that's the third one, women's champions. The fourth, very importantly, the collection of gender disaggregated data. Because without that, there is no impact, we don't know what we're doing, and we don't inform policy. And the last pillar is a gender forum chaired by the governor, which has a cross-section, a formal forum which will have a cross-section of not just banks or the banks associations, microfinance, but also industry leaders, women's voices, the more conservative part. Everyone is there so that they can talk about how we can improve policy as we go forward. So that's the bank. So it's very, very targeted. And then we set targets for everything. And not just women's accounts, but agricultural finance, SME finance, microfinance. All those targets regularly monitored in consultation, and we can talk about it a little bit later, with good results so far. So they're not impossible targets. So that's what we're trying to do. It's a bit forced. I mean, I think people can argue that we are over-forcing the issue, but I think there was no other choice. So that's what we've done.
Thank you for sharing that. And so encouraging to see what very clear policies you can arrive at when you don't accept just the status quo, you don't just look at top line figures, but you really ask the hard questions. And what I really like, despite those very, clear 5 pillars, you said this was done, consulting the stakeholders, and so it can be done. Quite encouraging for all of us here. And there's a lot of models that we have already learned from the panel, but I will now turn over from Asia and move to hear other good examples, and maybe turn over to you, Hazel, if you could share with us, what are the other emerging good practices for women's financial inclusion. If you could tell us a little bit about your experience in El Salvador.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm gonna answer in Spanish so I can make it quickly and you don't suffer with my English, okay? So you have time. Antes que nada, agradecer a la AFI por este espacio que está dando a El Salvador, a ese pequeño país de Centroamérica que está dando mucho, de qué hablar. En El Salvador el Banco Central de Reserva es el regulador del sistema financiero, por tanto nos compete implementar todas esas políticas públicas que le apliquen al sector financiero. Creo que uno de los grandes beneficios que hemos tenido como país es contar con un líder, con el presidente Nayib Bukele, que le apuesta al tema de inclusión y educación financiera, y eso ha sido uno de los primeros aceleradores que nosotros hemos tenido, que el apoyo viene del más alto nivel, y creo que eso ocurre en muy pocos países. Hay que hacer mucho lobby para que este tema avance. Uno de los grandes pasos que hizo el presidente fue aprobar la creación del Consejo Nacional de Inclusión Financiera, que aglutina a 10 entidades que se coordinan interinstitucionalmente y que trabajan por la inclusión y la educación financiera del país. Tenemos al Ministerio de Economía, el Instituto de Garantía de Depósito. Yo sé que muchos acá ya tienen esos consejos nacionales de educación financiera. En nuestro caso ha resultado bastante bien. Eso ha permitido coordinar todas las estrategias y los objetivos y los planes de acción que se aprobaron también gracias al presidente de la República en la Política Nacional de Inclusión Financiera el año pasado, y recientemente, hace dos semanas, tenemos la aprobación también de la Estrategia Nacional de Educación Financiera. Entonces, bajo esos 3 instrumentos, el país está avanzando, está dando grandes pasos. Uno de los pilares importantes de la Política Nacional de Inclusión Financiera ha sido la innovación y la digitalización de servicios financieros. En esta línea, el Banco Central impulsó también el año pasado el lanzamiento de un sistema de pagos gratuito para toda la población. Se llama Transfer 365. Es un sistema de pagos inclusivo que le ha ahorrado a la población alrededor de $12 millones en el primer año en el que ha estado a disposición. Y esto ha permitido no solo tener ese sector privado que maneja las transferencias interbancarias y que cobra comisiones, ¿verdad?, sino que le ha permitido también que las sociedades de ahorro y crédito participen en este sistema de pagos, que participen también las cajas de crédito, los bancos cooperativos. Entonces, eso ha sido un acelerador importante dentro de nuestras políticas, y también sabemos que las mujeres son las que tienen mayor miedo a realizar transferencias o a utilizar los servicios digitales, ¿verdad? Entonces estamos dando un acompañamiento a través del transfer. También lanzamos Transfer 365 móvil, que únicamente asociando el número de teléfono a una cuenta bancaria se pueden hacer transferencias y pagos interbancarios de manera gratuita los 365 días del año. Y lanzamos también el Transfer 365 Business para todos esos emprendedores que quieran realizar transferencias igual de manera gratuita. Otra de las buenas prácticas que tenemos es que estamos en constante diálogo con el sector privado. Tenemos mesas con la industria, y esto ha sido muy bueno porque les preguntamos si necesitaban alguna política especial o alguna regulación especial para darle acceso y uso a los servicios financieros, para promover el servicio financiero en mujeres, y ellos dijeron que no, ¿verdad?, que no era necesario, que ya habían mecanismos. Entonces, creo que hay un tema en el sector privado todavía de voluntad para promover cuentas, por ejemplo, de ahorros con requisitos simplificados que le lleguen a las mujeres, y hace falta también impulsar desde la parte de educación financiera cuáles son los beneficios. Por otro lado, también tenemos una estrecha relación con la Comisión Financiera de la Asamblea Legislativa. En algunos países lo conocen como Parlamento o el Congreso. Eso nos ha permitido como país hacer cambios estructurales importantes en leyes que tenían décadas sin modificarse, donde identificamos barreras importantes. Por ejemplo, eliminamos la cantidad de dinero mínimo para poder abrir una cuenta con requisitos simplificados. Eso hicimos una reforma a la ley para facilitar la inclusión financiera. También hemos hecho reformas al historial crediticio, a la protección al consumidor, y estamos trabajando también en eliminar, por ejemplo, comisiones por los servicios de adquiriencia en las terminales de cobro. Estamos promoviendo también servicios de tecnología sin contacto, todo esto de la mano con la Comisión Financiera. Las alianzas estratégicas que tenemos también con AFI con otras organizaciones, con la Fundación Esparcasen, con ONU Mujeres. Eso nos ha permitido también transversalizar el tema de género y no solo dejarlo en las instituciones financieras, ¿verdad? Sino que estamos colaborando con otras instituciones. Además, creo que es importante destacar que estamos hablando de mujeres que no conocen qué es una tarjeta de crédito, que no conocen qué es una cuenta de ahorro, y queremos acercar eso a la población. Entonces, estamos realizando también muchas ferias donde hacemos convenios con instituciones financieras, llevamos los productos financieros, llevamos las instituciones financieras a la población, a las mujeres en específico, para que la conozcan. Yo creo que una política de inclusión financiera por sí misma no va a lograr una igualdad de género, ¿verdad? Es muy difícil que eso lo haga, pero podemos promover una equidad y acceso de servicios financieros a las mujeres, y obviamente sabemos el potencial económico y social que esto le puede dar a las mujeres.
Thank you very much for that. And I think from your remarks, it's also very clear how important really collaboration with all stakeholders is involved, starting from having a champion as you started off, but really, the legislative bodies, and you also highlighted the private sector, which is a perfect segue to our sole private sector representative on the panel. I will turn over now to Amina. I think we heard a lot of signaling from the policymakers and the regulators how important this is and what that communicates to the private sector. What do you see as really the importance of this collaboration and dialogue in terms of really rolling out products that are gender intentional? As Seema said, if we say neutral, it's really not neutral. I think we know that already. So what do you want this public-private partnership or collaboration to result in from a private sector perspective?
Super, thank you so much. I, like many, I think everyone here, I'm thrilled to be back in person and seeing so many friends. I'd also like to add that I'm here with several Visa colleagues, all male, and we had an animated conversation about who was going to represent us, because my colleague Mario really wanted to be on this panel, but is actually going to present on cryptocurrency tomorrow instead. He's better versed in that. So we recognize that men are super important in the champions as well, and we're thrilled that we have so many men across our network who really believe in this. And what I'd like to share is really Visa's perspective about how together we can drive the outcomes that we want, and the different roles that we all play, because no one can do it independently. And our vision comes really from being a network of networks across so many countries across the world, more than 200 billion transactions in the last year, 70 million places of usage. It's a lot of local insight. But our real goal is, how do we enable inclusive and equitable participation in a digital economy? Right? Really, that's the end outcome. And why do I say participation in the digital economy? It's because what we're seeing today is that those people and businesses and communities that are able to participate in the digital economy are tending to do better than those who do not. So it's a factor in growing wealth and prosperity, but also in lives, right? What does it mean for you? And we really want to make sure that that reaches everyone, but we're also concerned about the risk of people and communities who will be left behind. And that can include people who today have been doing just fine, but might not be participating in the digital transformation. So with that in mind, what Visa's vision is that there are three things we should all focus on to drive greater equity and inclusion. The first is access, the second is trusted convenience, and the third is the knowledge and skills to be able to use that and participate. And I'll start with the first, which is access. And this is really table stakes. It's access to financial services, and time permitting, I'll come back to the kinds of products and services and innovations that Visa provides. But it's really how those are used. Access, and it's come up quite a bit already in the OFI discussions the last couple of days, it's also gateway services, energy, infrastructure, telecommunications, data. Policymakers have a huge influence on that and in encouraging investment and innovation that reaches the last mile. The second point after access is trusted convenience. And let me break those apart into both components. First is trust. So Visa, we are a trust brand. Nothing is more important to us than the trust in the service. And in the first instance, that's the billions of dollars that we pour into security, technical security, making sure that that security is there not just for a basic transaction or payments, but all kinds of innovations and all the connectivity across different kinds of providers. But trust, we know, goes beyond just security of a data point or transaction. It's the reliability, to know that that service is there for you 24/7, day in and day out. And sometimes that day in and day out can be harder than a pilot project or an innovation. It takes a lot of collaboration. And the third part of trust is for the user. It's if the service is actually achieving what you want with that service or product. That's a form of trust as well. The trusted convenience, here we're seeing technologies making just a world of difference on convenience. It's putting things in the palm of someone's hand. And when you put those two things together, it can be quite powerful. And I'd like to give a couple of examples. In Egypt, for example, we work with the post office and a fintech called PaySky on a mobile app. Everything is mobile if you're youth, and it just puts it in the palm of their hands. We have similar products in Italy as well, with the Ministry of Education on study programs, and also with the Italian Post Office on a post-to-pay green product, which is specifically for teenagers between 11 and 17, allowing them to pay for transportation or their lunch. And more importantly, it allows parents to set controls over what's spent. And anything that can square what a teenager wants and what a parent wants, yeah, let's go for that. So those are just a couple of the models of trusted convenience, and there's so many more. But it also goes to that point that it has to be localized. And local doesn't mean just for a geography. It means for the demographic, for the age, for the sector, for the interest, for what you're using it for. And the last thing then that I'd like to go to is the knowledge and skills. So we have access, trusted convenience, and knowledge and skills. Without the understanding or the ability to use something, it's really of no use to you, even if it's there and even if it's affordable. And what's super interesting is we're finding this very, very deep relationship between these three components of trust and skills. So for example, if you understand something, you tend to have more trust in it. If you're familiar with it, you'll have more trust in it. But we're also finding that the most effective ways to build both trust and also skills and education is through the local peer community. Right? Very often, and someone just on the way over here, one of our colleagues was talking about in her home country in Indonesia, the restaurant owners were writing out on the QR codes on their tables instructions for what people should do on to how to use a QR code to access the menu or how to pay. That's instruction, but it was also this trusted peer community. So that leaves us as a provider with an interesting question of how do we scale that? So from Visa's perspective, we do a lot about making our products really easy to use, simple, just-in-time information related to that. That's our responsibility. We're also providing a lot of financial education, public platforms, practical business skills, practical money skills, that we then collaborate with governments, with nonprofits, other institutions at a community level to make those available to all kinds of individuals to use them and to learn in ways that work for them. For example, across Latin America, we work with Fundes, a nonprofit, on the platform ENCO for small business owners, reaching, I think, 100,000 to date, including, I think, in El Salvador. Pretty sure of that as well. So it's just a few examples, right? It's incumbent upon us to make sure that information is available, to complement it, but also to partner with all of the community level networks, be they financial institutions, fintechs, cooperatives, to make sure there's the right product, but also the right kind of information. And of course, the role of government across all three of these is enormous, both in terms of setting the policies, but also the partnership to deliver. and I can elaborate on any of those, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, great. Just on your ending, I mean, you talk about access and trust and convenience and knowledge and skills. They could, as an imperative for visa, but they could also very well be public policy objectives that we're trying to pursue. So definitely alignment there, and why not coordinate and collaborate towards, these outcomes that we want to see. But I'd like to turn over to DG SEMA because, and want to see how, Amina, you will react to this because so it's great, there's alignment, we can collaborate. But I think one of the pillars you mentioned, DG SEMA, is that you have targets for the private sector to have the institutional diversity, as you said, and to serve women better. So very distinct targets. And having my old regulator hat on, I know that could be that could be an issue for supervised institutions if you're setting these targets. But explain to us, if you could share with us, how you came up with this, how the institutions also embraced and understood and appreciated it. And then after that, I'd like to turn over to Amina and see your reactions to that. But I'll follow up with a question later. But DG SEMA.
Thank you. So just to clarify, the targets, while we have the legal ability to make targets mandatory, we did not make them mandatory. We do that very, very rarely, and perhaps only in another area that we've done. Wherever there is severe market failure, where in our country we see a lot of market failure because of the providers of finance have other very profitable and risk-free avenues. But in this case, these were consultative. We used data. And we had conversations with almost every bank as to what the baseline would be. And I think over time, and it's only been, well, it hasn't even been a year, but we are already seeing that those targets are coming on. Some patchy with some banks, but I'll give you a few examples. A little while ago, I mentioned that we only had 11 million active women's accounts, which is embarrassingly small. For us, so we've made these targets over up to 2024. And for the calendar year, this calendar year, the target we've set is 25.7 million women's accounts. The data we have is for March, and we've already crossed 21 million. So, it's getting there. Another piece of data, agricultural finance. And we're in a largely agrarian economy. And so we set a target for 525,000 women borrowers for the end of this calendar year. We already have 421,000. So the targets were set in a way that are achievable and are being met. And then, of course, we will have conversations with those banks or microfinance or development finance organizations which have not met the targets, and there may be valid reasons. So it's interactive, but we will use our moral suasion wherever we can. And it's the same with SME. We've been very successful. We wanted about 13,000 borrowers for this year, for the end of this calendar year, and we got 12,000 already. So it's the focus that we have put on it. Many banks have now, the major ones, the larger ones, already come up with women's specific labeled products, which makes a huge difference. So I think all of those aspects have certainly helped.
No, that's a great clarification. I think clarity in communicating this to the banks too, and letting them appreciate why this is important. I mean, the diversity of their institutions and their portfolios will benefit them eventually. So if they also appreciate it, they also take it upon themselves to reach
So sorry,
these
I'm just
targets.
adding one more thing. They have also discovered that it contributes to the bottom line.
Exactly.
And
The
once
business
they
case.
realize that, then I think it happens on its own.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And you don't even need to set the targets anymore.
Yes.
They will meet them and
Hopefully
exceed
we
them.
will not need to.
For sure, for sure. No, thank you for that point. And I just want to pass back to Amina on this because, how does this also incentivize the thinking within the private sector, and in your case within Visa, to really think about developing products and services that are targeted to women for a specific for a specific market. I think we heard it. It has to be intentional. We have to know the needs, the life cycle, and to be really responsive to those needs. So, how does this help? How are you thinking about this?
So we unequivocally welcome the leadership and the prioritization from policymakers around women and reaching women and making that very clear. We're super committed to that, and we can follow your lead. As a company, there is perhaps very little that does not have specific data and key performance indicators attached to it across everything we do. I mean, that's how a business functions, and we have strong alignment. One of the challenges, and it's a practical challenge for Visa, is that we see the transaction, but there's nothing in a transaction that tells us who made that transaction. Was it a man or a woman? So we take data privacy incredibly seriously, right? This is one of these things, right? I mean, even when I'm doing studies, I lead research, and I'm doing studies, I'm like, I can't see any of the personal information that identifies an individual, because that's how seriously we take protecting your identity. But that's also a challenge for us, so we welcome that. How do we get to that? Some of you may remember that Visa set a commitment in support of the World Bank's goal of universal financial access to bring in 500 million people, which we did between unbanked and underserved from 2015, and we achieved that before the end of 2019. Of that, we estimated that 54% were women. Now, how do we say that? In full transparency, we had to do some data science using a combination of our transaction data and global public data. It was our best estimate. We worked really closely with the World Bank to make that as rigorous as possible, but we couldn't say down to the individual. But what I do want to say, going to gender intentionality, it really is about a diversity of products so that women, as well as men, can choose and have what's appropriate for them, and what's useful for their needs. And to that end, I would like to, just a short anecdote of a woman we came to meet through a survey that we did in Mexico in October of 2020, partway into the pandemic. And we did a survey of the micro and very, very small businesses in Mexico that had recently started to accept or use more digital payments. And we asked, what difference does this make? And one of the women who responded was the owner of a store. It was her parents' store in the rural mountains in the north of Mexico, right next to a big mine. And her parents were getting older and called on her to come help run the store. And when she took it over, it was 100% cash. But all of the men and it was all men who worked in the mine, had payment accounts thanks to the government's policies and particularly tiered KYC. And so she started to accept digital payments. And by the time we met her, or I should say the social research firm met her, she had about 70% of transactions were digital. More importantly, and over the course of 5 years, she said her sales grew 3 times. And what really struck me and what I want to leave you all with is what she said, well, the big difference it really made for her in her life, apart from the income, was that she was able to live with her wife in the state capital and with her kids, and her family time was great and quality was greatly improved because she could access her business and financial accounts through her phone and the computer. And so when we think about lives and livelihoods, I remember Anna Rosa's story really, really well because ultimately it is about life and it is about your family and your well-being. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, maybe I should now also turn over to El Salvador again, Hazel. Maybe you could share with us some of also your efforts in collecting this kind of data, going beyond the numbers and understanding the stories, and what are the success factors that you could share with us and with everyone today?
Sí, bueno, como muchos bancos centrales de los que estamos acá reunidos sabemos la importancia y manejamos y estamos acostumbrados a elaborar estadísticas macroeconómicas, por ende sabemos lo importante que es tener información de calidad, oportuna, desagregación por sexo, geográficamente también. Entonces, en este sentido, y me gustaría compartirles algunos datos sobre la encuesta específicamente para El Salvador del Global FinTech. En El Salvador, el 23.2% de mujeres poseen una cuenta financiera, una cuenta en una institución financiera. El 10.8% ha solicitado algún tipo de crédito. Mujeres que poseen cuenta dinero móvil, 10.1%. Mujeres con al menos una tarjeta de crédito, 10.6%. 22.5% de mujeres ha realizado o recibido un pago digital. Entonces, ¿qué estamos observando acá? Existen obviamente brechas y barreras naturales que estamos observando en el acceso de mujeres a este tipo de productos, ¿verdad? Entonces, ¿qué tenemos que hacer como reguladores? Crear regulación, ¿verdad? Obviamente para disminuir estas barreras, las garantías que les exigen a las mujeres, simplificar requisitos. De igual manera, en El Salvador, alrededor del 65% de la población tiene internet, el 85% tiene un teléfono móvil. Sin embargo, al ver las estadísticas y los datos, por ejemplo, el 5.8% utiliza el teléfono para hacer pagos o facturas de mujeres. El 6.3% de mujeres usa el teléfono móvil o internet para enviar dinero. El 5.4% de mujeres usa el teléfono móvil para comprar en línea. Entonces, obviamente aquí estamos observando otro tipo de brechas, otro tipo de barreras, probablemente de autonomía económica y de poder de decisión sobre el dinero por sí en el hogar, ¿verdad? Entonces, estamos trabajando mucho para darle información a Helen. Y en este sentido, hemos hecho varias encuestas. Comenzamos con la primera este año para conocer un poco cuáles eran las posiciones de liderazgo de las mujeres en las instituciones financieras y cómo estaban ofreciendo también las instituciones financieras productos y servicios financieros. Como lo ha dicho la mayoría acá, únicamente el 14% de las mujeres está en posiciones de dirección en las instituciones financieras. Las juntas directivas están representadas por alrededor de un 18%. Los puestos de dirección representan un 40% de mujeres, pero cuando vamos hacia abajo y vemos el equipo staff, la gente que mueve las instituciones, el 55% son mujeres. Y cuando les preguntamos a las instituciones si están ofreciendo algún tipo de producto financiero, mencionaron que sí, que tienen productos dirigidos a las mujeres. Eso ha sido muy gratificante verlo y hemos observado también cómo a través del Consejo Nacional de Inclusión Financiera, nuestros bancos estatales y nuestros bancos de desarrollo están ofreciendo productos específicos, líneas de crédito, microcréditos, líneas para adquirir vivienda. También estamos recolectando información sobre finanzas verdes, 10 minutes. Y hemos visto que las mujeres, que las instituciones financieras están dando productos financieros verdes al menos al 17% de mujeres. Entonces, en este sentido, para nosotros es muy importante tener información desagregada, información que nos sirva para hacer las mejores políticas, sino a quién nos estamos dirigiendo si no tenemos esa información la más actualizada posible. Estamos actualizando la encuesta de acceso y uso de servicios financieros con AFI. Ya tenemos resultados, no la actualizábamos desde el 2016. Vamos a tener una nueva fotografía del Salvador. Sabemos que estamos haciendo muchos cambios, probablemente no se recojan todos los frutos en esta medición que estamos haciendo en estos momentos, pero sí creemos que estamos avanzando a grandes pasos. También estamos actualizando la encuesta de capacidades. Vamos a ver cómo están, qué tan buenos hemos sido como Banco Central y como Consejo Nacional de Educación Financiera en fortalecer la parte de educación. Y también estamos actualizando la encuesta de sistemas de pagos con la AFI. Entonces, sí creo que es muy importante el uso de data muy actualizada. Creemos que esa es la única vía para formular políticas públicas que le funcionen a las mujeres y en general a todos los grupos vulnerables. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for that. My device did not work towards the end, so I had to rely on my very poor Spanish. But thank you for that intervention, the real importance of data, understanding the gaps. And I think you shared some insights on gaps that go at different levels, right? From just the products and services, but also access to a mobile phone. So we have to think about whether, these building blocks have some exclusionary components to them. Is it harder for a woman to get access to a mobile phone, for an ID, for the rails, so to speak, that Helen was talking about? So being very intentional at all these levels, at infrastructure, at policy, at product level, I think is key. So thank you for those insights. And I think I will turn over to our now sole male representative on the panel. Go back to you. My question here is really about your biggest challenges in collecting the data, but I think you already discussed that earlier in terms of the challenges that you faced. So maybe you could share a little bit of forward looking in terms of where you think work still needs to be done, what you would prioritize, knowing what you already know moving forward.
Thank you. I think in Fiji we see this gender issue, and we see the numbers and the reduction in the gender gap. And this we had 2 demand-side surveys, and this has been reaffirmed by the numbers that we had on the supply side. So we see our gap has been the latest one around 2020, 2021 is 11%. So we see a large commendable progress. But as we have been reiterating, it's not good enough. We are seeing the glass is half empty. There's still a lot of work to be done. So thinking about the issue, delving a bit deeper, we see that there is like a two-speed type of thing, where there's a greater economic prosperity in the urban areas, where there's more educated communities, more affluence. There seems to be a greater acceptance. So it's telling us that education is the key. The norms, the social norms and all seem to be falling a lot, and this is out in the rural areas and the vulnerable sectors of the community, in the housing, in the projects where things are a bit more tougher. So it's harder for a woman in those settings to have the freedom to just go and open an account without the husband agitating a bit. And this is confirmed anecdotally with a lot of we go out into the community. I have my team sitting there, and we go out with partners funded by UN, CDF, and this is a common story that's coming back to us. So it's a great thawing of these social norms, but it's never good enough. It's just like us as central bankers. We have 2% growth, 3% growth, but it's never good enough. We want more, and more because we still see that right at the heart of it is still, a large freezing. At the breakfast, we had the sharing that my colleague, Deputy Governor LCS mentioned, and I listened to the other countries sharing, and these are deputy governors, female deputy governors, and my country hasn't got a female deputy governor yet. But in saying that, our executive management, there's only three males. 2 is me and a governor that are males, and 1 more, the head of economics, and the rest are females. So it's only a matter of time. So like as I said, there's a great thawing. I think the social and the cultural norm is our greatest challenge, to enable the woman to be able to feel the freedom to go and open an account. I think if we reach that step, there may be other issues that we'll grapple with. As I know my colleagues in the more affluent, like in the urban areas, I just asked a few of them, male colleagues, do you have a joint account or do you have separate accounts? No, we have separate accounts. Okay. So I'm a bit old and mature. I only have I have a joint account, and it's all in my wife's control. So I find that that's how we keep peace at home. So, there's a thawing, it will grow. So, and I said this two-speed, we need to work. So this, this, this data that we are gathering, we've gathered the broad data. Now the urgency is to dive deep into that. And anecdotal evidence suggests to us that we need to focus more on some of these rural settings, some of these vulnerable settings. And then we swing right back to, if we do our role well as a central bank, economic prosperity is number one. When the country is doing well, then everybody rises. So, it's a roundabout.
Spoken like a true champion, don't you think? So thank you very much for that. And I think, just hearing a central banker talk and try to understand social norms to inform the policies that you make is really quite encouraging for me as we look forward to what is to come. And before I end the panel, I will ask DGLC for the last question for this panel is, being where you are, sitting where you are, and also in the AFI group, what do you see for this women's financial inclusion? What is the future look, let's say, in the next 5 years? What do you expect to see? And I hope that's the same from what you also hope to see the next 5 years.
Thank you so much. We definitely, in 5 years, want to see that the gender gap in access to finance has shrunk even further. Great that it has dropped. We want to see it shrink. What we recognize is that in every part of the network, more women are getting access to finance, which is great. So we want to see more of that. We want more action on that. Data is going to be critical, and we want to see every member of the network actually implement sex disaggregated data. It is not easy. You've heard some of the challenges, but it's got to be done. So we need to recognize where the challenges are and what support is needed to help every member country do it. Data is king. Data is important not only for regulators and policymakers, it is important for the entire ecosystem, if you think of Helen's egg, to really engage broadly. And it's also important for the providers of financial services to themselves understand how to design and offer services and products better. So that's number one. We also want to see, lastly, that we're making traction on women in leadership, not only in policy and regulation, but also in the provision of financial services. As one of us at the breakfast said yesterday, quoting Madame Christine Lagarde, if there had been a Lehman Sisters, the global financial crisis may never have happened, and the world would have been the better for it. Women are responsible and good at managing credit, and are good when they're given opportunities to lead. And we believe that women in leadership will go a long way in promoting gender-inclusive finance. It may be like that like in Samoa, we may have more women than men getting access to credit, but that would be nice for a change. But really, it's gender-inclusive finance. What we don't want to see are gaps and inequity. So more of that. And just lastly, the key point is resilience, financial resilience. So account opening is only the first step. But we want to see that across the value chain, a woman has access to finance in various forms, product services that allows her to start, to sustain and grow a business, and to make the life-transforming changes that are needed. And so really, all society approach, all hands on deck, and I believe that AFI is poised to support the network in that regard going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would take that as all our collective goal to see in 5 years exactly the things that DGLC said, and products that are responsive and effective for women beyond just access, but really what can help them towards positive outcomes, to improve their financial health, their resilience, and really take advantage of economic opportunities. So let us collectively commit and champion that 5-year vision. Hopefully the mapping that Helen will make will inform us more as a network, good practices that we can share around the network. And I look forward to 5 years from now what we will see about women's financial inclusion. So thank you very much, dear panelists. Excellent interventions. Thank you to our presenters earlier and to all of you for your kind attention. Good afternoon.